Welcome back to my workshop. Today I'm going to show you how to make this grandfather clock out of an old door frame. Let's have a look. So it's now the early part of June in 2019 and I've decided to enter an item into the Rettenden Show and I'm going to make something made out of wood. Now I've decided to make one of these, which is a miniature grandfather clock. The material I've got is this pile of wood here, which is a load of old door stops, but it is actually hardwood. This was like thresholds and window frames. So I've got to try and turn that into some usable wood. I've got already here, you can see my pendulum. This is the clock mechanism. I'm going to be using that. So what I've done is I've taken from this drawing, from this picture, I've literally measured off of the picture. I've scaled up the measurements to the size I want based on the size of this clock mechanism. And I come up with a set of plans. Well, it's not really a set of plans. It's a drawing. It's a scale drawing. So what I'm going to do, I should be able to measure straight off the drawing for the dimensions of my workpiece. So the first thing I've got to do is turn this pile of wood into some usable material. So let's get on with that.
So the first issues I had with the wood, it was covered in a combination of silicone and nails, and there was little pieces of wood actually stuck to it as well. So I had to clean all of that off. That's a good idea if you're doing this to use some old tools like an old scraper as your first approach to it, because if there are any nails, it's easy to ruin some decent tools by hitting, you know, like nails or studs or anything like that. So here I used a couple of old scrapers and then I made the mistake of using my work zone battery powered plane, because I did actually hit a nail, so as you can see there, and it basically ruined the blade. But basically cleaned off all of the silicone and the rubbish and assessed which direction I was going to cut the wood. I used my bandsaw here to basically rip it into strips of wood, probably about 18mm thick. Then I got out my trusty planer here. This is a Fox planer. It's quite an industrial tool, so obviously I understand not everyone's got one of these. This can be done with a normal electric plane, or if you're feeling really enthusiastic, you can do it with a hand plane. But basically what I did there is for each piece of wood I got a flat edge and a flat surface. So there's a flat edge and flat surface, and then I could convert my planer into thicknessing mode, and then that way you can get an even piece of wood. So you're effectively turning some rough cut wood into some usable size planks, for want of a better word. Now these are all a uniform thickness, because if I'm going to be sticking the pieces of wood together, I do need them all to be the same thickness. What you see me doing here is I'm putting them through the thicknesser, and this is now on the edges, so I'm making sure that the width of each piece of wood is equal. Because the piece of wood runs on the bottom plate there, the top cutters are parallel with that, so it's guaranteed to cut parallel. Then I basically put away my planer, had a quick tidy up, quick sweep up, and then moved on to the next bit, which was I'd obviously already done my design, and now what I'm doing is I'm measuring straight off of the design and cutting the pieces of wood as I need them, and then obviously cutting them on the table saw there. So I started off first, I'm doing the two sides, which you can see here. and then I'm cutting the middle sections, which I refer to as the shelves. So they're the dividers between the clock mechanism, the pendulum area, and the base. What I'm doing here is marking out where those shelves are going to go, and then I'm going to do a rebate into both the sides to fit the shelves in. So although they're going to be glued, they will also fit like a joint into either side. Now obviously all the shelves are exactly the same size, all of the rebates are exactly the same depth, so the sides of the clock should remain parallel. So there's a trial fit there with the shelves in place. I've got it clamped, it's not glued, I've got it clamped in place at the moment while I sort out that part there is going to be the clock face. None of this is actually glued at the moment, and now I'm measuring up for a small section at the back at the bottom. I didn't have a piece big enough, so what I have to do is stick two pieces of wood together. So I've measured it, stuck two pieces together, clamp that up while I continue making the back panel there. A little bit of sand in there on my Triton belt sander, and then I can move on to what you can see here is the doors. So there's two doors. There's a lower door which is in front of the pendulum, and then you've got the upper door which is on the clock face. These weren't going to just be solid doors, they were going to be cut out with a glass insert. I decided to not do them square, I wanted to do them so they got rounded corners and a bit of shape to them. So the best thing for this is to use my scroll saw. So I forgot what it was called then. Use my scroll saw and do that like this.
Okay, so that's the end of the first day. I'm going to leave it there. I've got most of my major components cut now. I'll quickly show the idea of how it's all supposed to be going back together. Still loads of things to do. So a quick assembly. Let me show you. So what we have is two side panels. Then we have some shelves, some back panels, and the doors. So to go together, the shelves should fit in like this, then this top one goes on here, like that. So that's about the size of it. Then you've got a bottom shelf which will fit in there. Then you have top shelf. Then you have the middle back panel. Actually, let's put it this side. Goes in here. Like that. Then you have the front panel, which is going to be the clock face. This is going to go in here and be slightly recessed. Then you've got a lower front panel which goes on here. The lower door where the pendulum is going to be. Let's put this on here somehow. And then the actual clock face door, that's going to go up here somewhere. And then I've got another panel here which goes around the back. So that's about the size of it for so far today. I shall resume tomorrow.
So it's the next day. Obviously you can tell that because we've got a different t-shirt on. What I'm doing here is I'm using a light panel, which is just basically a ceiling light panel, which I've showed you how to make in one of my previous videos, and I'm just using that to put some light behind the actual drawing, so then I could trace around to cut the shape for the top crown there, I'll call it. Obviously that crown's got to be parallel with the top door, which is a funny shape. So it's all done by hand. I could have done this on a CNC machine, but it's a handmade item, so I thought I'd do it by hand. So now here I'm cutting some battens, and the reason I'm cutting the battens is because between the three, well, you can see the three sections there of the clock, the base, the middle and the top, there's going to be some decorative moulding around the edges. So this is what I'm cutting here. I'm using my table saw sled. I've screwed in a 45-degree angle piece of batten in there so I could cut them out as you would do a picture frame. And it's quite difficult because obviously they've got to be precise because they've got to go around the clock, which is a predetermined size. Here I'm cutting into the middle or the upper shelf where the pendulum is going to go. Now obviously I want to do this before it's all glued together because I'm not going to be able to get inside the clock once it's glued. So the hole I use there, I just use my scroll saw just to cut a hole for the pendulum, doing a trial fit here of where the pendulum swings, and that all looks good. So nothing is stuck together yet. I'm still cutting pieces and measuring it. As you can see there, that was going to be one of the decorative mouldings, and now I'm marking out for where the clock face is going to go. I was using the size of the hands, like the minute hand and the hour hand, as an indication of how big the clock is going to be. Then over onto the CNC machine. Now I've cut this down quite considerably. I'm looking for a design of clock, something traditional, but I ended up doing it from scratch. What you can see here that takes a few seconds actually took me a couple of hours. But basically using this Vectric Aspire software, I can design a clock face, and then it can show me what it's actually going to look like in real life on a piece of wood. So if you look carefully there, that's what it's going to look like. So I've got my clock face piece of wood. I've marked the centre of it, which is where it's going to start, and then set my CNC machine going. I've got a 60-degree V-groove bit in this. I know obviously not everyone's got a CNC machine. I built this one a couple of years ago from scratch, and it's been working perfectly. Best thing I've ever built. But you could carve that by hand, possibly using a Dremel, but it would take a long time. But you can get some good results just doing a Dremel. That's how I used to do it before. Now here, while my CNC machine is cutting the clock face, I started work on sizing up the final size for the mouldings. These were quite time consuming. At the moment you can see they're still just squares of wood. While I've got my sander out, just check the CNC machine's going. While I've got the sander out, I've converted it to a bobbin sander, and just trimming up the doors so they're as round as possible inside, so there's no sharp edges. These have to be quite smooth. CNC machine's still going. These have to be quite smooth because obviously there's going to be glass inserts, and you don't want any sharp bits of wood sticking out because it will cause a stress point in the glass. So here I'm now sorting out the hole at the front there where the pendulum goes. I was just making sure that it was round on all the corners because again, sanding that once it's actually fitted is going to be quite difficult. Another trial fit, putting it all together. And it looks like the CNC machine is finally finished. Let's have a look, see what it looks like. Obviously covered in sawdust at the moment, and this is the moment of truth. Just remove it from the CNC machine. Now I had a quick look at it when it came out of the CNC machine. and it does look like it's missed some of the detail on the corners, so I'm going to have to finish it by hand or with a Dremel. Just quickly give me an idea here to see whether or not the clock is in the right position, and it looks like it wasn't. There seems to have been about a 10mm offset on my CNC machine, so basically what that meant is I had to raise the clock face up, which was a bit difficult because obviously it was already on a fixed piece of wood. So what I did is I chopped a piece off the top, moved up the panel with the clock face on it, and then put an insert at the bottom, so basically moved it up by the 10mm, and that's what you see me doing here. So that was not an ideal situation, but it's wood, it can all be worked and it can all be repaired. Just cutting a hole in the centre of the clock there, and drawing around the actual clock unit. I bought the clock unit when I was at Maker Central this year. It was only a few quid. You can get these off Amazon very cheaply, and this one's actually got a pendulum with it, which is quite nice. Just using my palm router here to route out a recess for the clock body, and then a trial fit again. Take it all apart. This, you can see, that's the clock face. I'm sticking the 10mm insert to raise the clock up, and then I think it's almost time to do a final fit. So all the joints are very tight, so a bead of glue on all of them. They had to be assembled in a certain order, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to get everything together. I did the main carcass and the back panels first, clamped that together while I was waiting for the clock face to dry. As soon as the clock face was dry, then I could remove a couple of the clamps just to insert the clock face. But here, using quite a few clamps, and while it's clamped, cleaning up as much of the glue as possible, because later on when I do the staining and the waxing, if there's any glue, it doesn't absorb into the wood, so keeping it clean while you're building it is always a very good idea. Okay, onto the clock face again. As I said, the CNC machine didn't quite go deep enough to do the decorative corners. It was a bit of a shame because the actual engraving was only about 0.5 millimetre deep, but of course there's a little bit of an offset on my table, so it completely missed it. So I've ended up doing it with the Dremel. I did an initial engraving here, but then I had further engraving to do once the clock was actually stuck. The clock face was actually stuck in the casing. This was a little bit time consuming, but it gave me a chance also to tidy up. If you look there, I'm using a tiny little grindstone. I'm cleaning up some of the inserts between the minutes on the clock face. Now it's all dry, a sand, and then I give it a quick blow off with my airline, and then I can unclamp the area where the clock face goes in, push it in, make sure it fits, okay, pull it out, put some glue on it, and then you see I use the little corners there. They're the same thickness as the rest of the wood, and I just use that as a depth gauge, and then checked it again with a rule afterwards. Now this is the lower front panel. I wanted it to say Rettenden Village Show. I had to do this twice. The first time it went down probably 2 millimeters too deep, and it made the letters pretty much unreadable. So effectively it ruined that one, so I had to do the whole panel again. But in the end it was a success. Okay, I've cut another 3 pieces of wood here, and this is for one of the bases. Now there's going to be 2 bases. It's going to be a lower base and an upper base. These are literally just squares of the hardwood stuck together, as you can see there. And then once they're dried, I can trim them off. The lower base is going to be bigger, slightly bigger, so it gives you a slight pyramid effect when it's built up. Now here I've started moving on to the design of the crown around the top of the clock. and now I'm moving on to the profiling of the doors. Now this is obviously the bottom door. I've just got a round over bit in my router. I've clamped that into the vise to hold it steady. I would normally use a router table, but this was quicker. Marking out here for where the glass is going to go, and I'm also going to use the same router to take away most of the wood there. Now if you see, I've put the insert that I cut, I've put that back in just to keep the router at the right height. It saves any tipping, so you end up with cleaner corners. So I did that with the bottom door and then the top door. Now the problem I had here is on the last couple of inches of doing this, I broke the door. Now obviously I'd already spent hours doing this door, and there, bang, the door actually broke, as you could see there, and it was a bit of a disaster. Slightly disheartened, but because it's wood, you can clean it up, stick it together with some wood glue, and do some repairs, which is what I had to do in the end. Now this is one of the bases. Obviously when I was sticking it together, I didn't put enough protection between the wood and the worktop, and it stuck to the worktop, so it took me a good 10 minutes to get that off, but managed it in the end. You can see there the two bottom bases, the lower base and the upper base, just to check it all for size. And then this is the first bit of sanding. Started off with my random orbital sander with some fairly coarse grit paper, I think 40 grit to start with, then moved on to 100, I think it was 120 grit, and then eventually I finish off with 240 grit. These are obviously getting finer and finer and finer. Obviously the finer you go, the better finish you're going to get, but obviously you've got to balance up how much time you want to spend sanding it. And I settled for about 240 grit. Now there you saw me just stick on the front panel, the one with Rettenden Village Show on it, and now I'm working on the mouldings that go around the clock. Now obviously I'm profiling these to the same as around the edges of the doors, so it all matches. So the door edges and the mouldings, there's some continuity to the clock. Okay, table saw sled comes out again, and here I'm just trimming up the two base parts, the lower and the middle base, and then again going round again with the same profiling bit, just to make sure they're the same as the doors and the mouldings. Okay, a little bit more sanding, obviously where I've stuck the front panel on, just to make sure the edges are all flush. Hit that again with my random orbital sander, and now I've started to stick on the mouldings. Now there's no cutouts for the mouldings, so as you see here I'm using a square, just to make sure started off with the front moulding, and then make sure using the square that the two side mouldings are parallel, and then in theory the rear moulding will line up. Now I did that obviously for the lower mouldings and the upper mouldings. Put them in place there, all stuck with glue. Nice big weight there to hold it in place while I'm finishing off the other ones. A quick trial to see how it all fits together. So the two bases, the main clock body, the lower door and the upper door, just hold them in place with a bit of tape, just to make sure that they look okay. Yep. And then the top crown just clamped on with some clamps just to see what it's like. So now I've traced around the same profile as the upper crown to make an additional crown around the top. This gives it a bit more depth. There's basically two layers of trim at the top. So what you see me doing here is I've cut the upper crown and the upper outer edges. It'll make sense in a minute if you bear with me. obviously sanding again using my sander here, and this makes sure that doing it with this sander rather than doing it by hand, make sure that the sides and the upper faces are all perpendicular with each other. It gives a much better finish. And then again, running around the profiles with the same router bit that I used previously. Okay, this is the base. Mark the center of the base, and in the lower base and the upper base I've drilled 4 holes. Now obviously I had to make sure they didn't all line up, because I need the bottom base to screw into the upper base and then the upper base to screw into the clock body. It will become clear in a second. So that's the 2 bases screwed together. Here, just trimming off some of the upper mouldings just to make sure it's all flush. Give it a little bit of a sand, and then I can stick that on. Obviously a bit of wood glue. I tend to use Gorilla wood glue. That's my glue of choice at the moment. I've always used Evo Stick, but now I use Gorilla Glue. It seems to be a little bit more user friendly. Okay, putting the mouldings on. So basically glue, spread the glue, put the moulding on, clamp it in place with some small clamps there, and then clean up any excess. Obviously, as I say, the more excess you clean off, the better the finish is going to be. So there, just using my Japanese saw to make sure the edges are flush for the final bits of trim. Same again, glue, clamp, clean. Now the base, take the bases apart. Then I can screw the upper base to the body of the clock, and then the lower base to the second base. Starting to look like a clock now, so I'm getting a better feel of how the final product is going to look. Bit of a tidy up here because I needed to get my planer thicknesser out again, because I want to make a back panel. Originally I was going to leave it open, but it looked like it needed a panel. So just found another piece of the door frame, use my planer thicknesser again, same principle, get a flat surface, get a right angled surface, and then run it through the thicknesser, and then that effectively gives you a clean board. Once you've got a clean board, then you've got something to work to. Then quick tidy up, cut the piece of board to the size I need to fill the back of the clock. Use my bandsaw to cut it, and then I had to take a tiny little sliver off, and then drill a hole in it, because obviously you need to be able to remove that to get to the clock to change the batteries. Onto the glass. Now obviously the lower panel, lower door and the upper door both got glass in it. The lower door is obviously just a rectangular piece of glass, but the upper door is it's like a triangle, or it's a triangle at the top. So I've had to, as you see there, I've had to cut that at an angle. That was a bit of a worry. I did break one piece of glass, but both of the pieces of glass come from some old picture frames that I actually recovered out of the bin, so they didn't cost anything. If you look very carefully, you can see that the 2 types of glass are slightly different. The lower door has got a slightly darker tinge to it, but it doesn't notice in the end product. Here I'm clearing off the position for the hinges. I had a lot of trouble with the hinges, and here I've got to, I should have clamped the clock down here, because every time I was chiseling, the clock was moving, which doesn't make for a good finish. So lots of chiseling, trying to make it as neat as possible, using a little nylon hammer here with a very sharp chisel. I didn't realise until very recently how beneficial it is to have a very sharp chisel. It does make a much better job. So cleaning it up as much as possible, checking it for size. The actual screws I had were slightly too long, so each screw I had to grind down a little bit. Otherwise they would have poked out the back of the clock, or the side of the clock. Here just making some sawdust, mixing it with some wood glue and use it as a temporary wood filler. It works.
Right, a quick catch up now. I haven't done any videoing for the last couple of hours. I've been far too busy with the doors. Now these doors have been a bit more tricky than I expected. Over the last few hours, I think you saw me cut the glass for both the panels. Obviously one of the pieces of glass is a nice triangular shape. That was quite tricky. But the biggest problem I've had is with the hinges. Obviously these hinges, just normal butt hinges, what could possibly go wrong? But they've been very difficult to fit because they were slightly too big, but I couldn't really get them any smaller. So I've had to modify the case quite considerably. And also fitting the hinges to the doors, I've ended up with this sort of mess. So I've got to try and make this pretty now. As you can see, I've had to cut out half the door and actually fix the hinges in that way. But I'm now in the process of making good all around the hinges. So I shall carry on with that, and you can carry on watching me sand and sand and sand. But we're getting there. Let's carry on.
So carry on we did. Now the next stage, obviously I have a bit of a clear up here because I'm going to have to start making sure that everything's clean and clear, because if I start staining, you don't want any airborne dust. So all the time that this is going on, I've got my extractor going to clean the air. I've got a air cleaner in the workshop. Lots of sanding here with quite a fine grade paper. You can see the white stuff, the white paper I'm using here. It's like a cabinet grade sandpaper. It's worth putting the effort in. The more effort you put in the sanding, the better the final finish is going to be. Blowing it off here with my compressor, just to make sure that I'm not putting sawdust anywhere it shouldn't be, and then cover it over. And now it's time to decide what colour I'm going to do it. Did a quick trial with the same species of wood, just 3 or 4 different types of colour, just to decide which colour I want. Oh, hello, who's that? Once I decided what colour I want, it did take 2 tries with this. I was going to originally go for a very light English oak, but I ended up going with something slightly darker. I think it was actually antique pine that I went for in the end. It gave the right colour for this type of clock. All of the pieces I used there, the stained pieces, sample pieces, I actually wrote which stain I used on the back just for future reference. I shall keep those, so any of that species of wood I use, if I need a specific colour, I've got something to refer to. So I stained it first in a light oak colour, and it wasn't good enough. It actually went a slightly green colour, so it then settled on this antique pine colour, and as you can see here, stain. Basically rubbed it on with a cloth, making sure I get into all the recesses. Used a paintbrush to get in all the grooves, just to make sure there's no bits that aren't treated, or to make sure there's no bits of glue that are stopping the wood from absorbing the colour. This takes a long time, but again, if you put the effort in, you will actually get some good results. So once it's stained, make sure you don't get any puddles of stain, because they will end up with dark points. So make sure the covering is as even as possible. Here doing the doors, again I had to use the paintbrush quite a bit to get into all the little recesses. Now onto the glass. What I wanted to do is make sure there's no sharp edges, so a quick rub on sandpaper. Obviously you can't go mad with that. Just a little rub, it takes off the sharp edges, and then it gives me the opportunity to clean the glass in just normal soapy water. It's just normal washing up liquid. Then using a hot glue gun to fix the panes of glass into place. There's no load on these panels, so it's just to hold the very light glass into place. Now using a natural beeswax here, give it a good coating. I actually put a little bit too much coating on here because there was so much of it. I left it a little bit too long and it was a bit difficult to actually dress the wax properly, but we got there in the end. So put the wax on, leave it for a while, wait for it to dry, and then you can start buffing it off.
So I've put on the first coat of wax. I've quickly polished that off a little bit. I've still got to wait for it to dry a bit more and then give it another buff. I thought while I was waiting for that to dry, I would address in here on the picture, there's some chains and some little counterweights. Now obviously with the real clock, these counterweights are all part of the winding mechanism. This one's obviously a digital clock, so it hasn't got those, but I thought I'd put some in it anyway. So what I've done, I've gone to a home base and I bought some chain that you'd normally use for a plug in a sink. This is a gold chain obviously, so I can use that. Cost me £2. And for these little counterweights, I was looking for some little brass cylinders basically, and what I ended up finding was some RCA electrical connectors, which are for connecting speakers, and they're a sort of goldy colour, so I thought, ooh, they look nice. So they're like a cylinder with a knurled design on it. Obviously it's got the electrical connectors in either end. So what I'm going to do is, like I've done here, just poke the chain inside, and then what you have is this. So let's see what that looks like. What I'll do is I'll just put a little bit of glue in there, stop it all falling apart. That's the idea. Let's see what happens.
So once I'd decided what I was going to do there, by that time the wax had dried completely. So using my just a normal towel here, try to separate the towel so you've got a initial buff off side on one side and then a final buff off on the other side of the towel. It makes it quicker than swapping between different types of rag. Obviously finally finishing it off with a lint free cloth, but that was enough to get the main wax off. Now here, using a little hand drill, I've just drilled a couple of little holes and put a couple of those little eye screws that you would use for a net curtain into the back of the clock. This is just something for the chain to hang off of. So now my chain cut to length with my electrical connectors on the end. I think it looks okay, that bit. It was quite good. And now for what's almost the final assembly. Putting some little markers there on the face of the clock, and then finally doing my little design on the bottom. I've got a new wood burning tool, pyrography pen, so quickly drew my design on the base. Went around with my pyrography burner. Just there you go, my little logo, Frank's little workshop.
That's it. It's all complete. We started off with our picture, which we stole off the internet. I made a drawing, a full-scale drawing, and then we made this, which has turned out okay. I'm quite impressed with it. All in all, I'm very pleased with how it's come out. Yeah, there's not a lot else I could have done to it really. It's quite nice. So this is my entry into the 2019 Rettenden Village Show. Hopefully I'll win something, which would be nice. But if not, I've just enjoyed it, and now I've got a free clock because I've made it out of bits of old door frame. So thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. That's what keeps me going. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye. So that's it. Oh God. Quickly show you what's going to be assembled.